Hello. Hi, my name is Malia Cromer, and I'm the director of the Sarah T. Hughes Center for Politics here at Goucher College. Welcome. I'm so glad to see so many of you here tonight. Goucher College is committed to supporting civic engagement through our academics, work with the Goucher College poll, which I'm intimately familiar with, and by welcoming government leaders to campus. We are proud to host the Maryland Gubernatorial Candidate Climate Forum and are thrilled to provide a forum for public discourse on these important environmental and climate issues. Before I turn it over to Kim Coble, the Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, who will introduce our moderators, candidates, and outline the rules of the forum, I'd like to thank our sponsors: the Maryland LCV Education Fund, Maryland Matters, Sierra Club Maryland Chapter, the NAACP Maryland State Conference and Baltimore County Branch, CCAN Action Fund, and Ed Hatcher and Angie Cannon. It's always wonderful to partner with organizations that share our community values. Now, it's my honor to turn it over to Kim.
Thank you, Malia. And thank you all for joining us tonight. It's great to see everybody, and not only those in person, but those virtually. And I also want to thank the candidates for joining us again. We had a forum last night at University of Maryland, and this is our second one, and I really appreciate your time and dedication to being here. I'm Kim Coble. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters and the Maryland League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. Maryland LCV uses political action and education to fight for clean water, healthy air, and resilient communities for all Marylanders. Between last night and tonight, be in person and virtual, we have over 1,000 people joining us for this forum. And we are honored, Maryland LCV Education Fund is honored to be a co-host of this event with Maryland Matters. Maryland Matters has been a much-needed addition to the Maryland journalism landscape and shares our commitment to ensuring Maryland voters understand the threat of climate change. Before I introduce our panelists, I also want to acknowledge Chuck Percari, Maryland LCV Education Fund Board Chair, and Maryland LCV staff for their dedication and work to ensure that these forums have been informative and educational. I'm proud to introduce our 4 excellent panelists for this evening. Josh Kurtz, the founding editor of Maryland Matters. Staci Hartwell from NAACP Maryland State Conference and a board member of Maryland LCV Education Fund. I'm proud to introduce Stella Krajick. She's a Goucher College political science student. And Sheilah Kast, who is the radio host of On the Record at WYPR. The framework for this evening is as follows. Our panel has crafted several questions over an array of environmental topics and has randomly selected 3 candidates to answer each question. The panelists will rotate through the sets of questions, with each candidate giving 1 minute to answer. Additionally, candidates will also be asked to make a 2.5-minute opening statement and a 2-minute closing statement. As already suggested, but let me also remind you, please silence your cell phones. And we also ask the audience that's in person for no signs or cheerings for a particular candidate. This is a forum, not a debate. And whether you're joining us here in person or tuning in virtually, we encourage you to join the conversation on social media with the hashtag MDGovClimateForum. We're live tweeting also at MDLCV. So many thanks to all of you for coming, to the candidates and to the panelists. And with that, I'll turn it over to Josh Kurtz.
Thank you, Kim. Not sure if we're on, but good evening, everybody. Thanks again to the candidates for joining us. Thanks to the members of the audience, both live and out there in TV land. I'll introduce the candidates in a minute and talk about how we propose to do this. I actually first want to talk about the candidates who are not here. As folks have said, this is day 2 of forums that we were doing last night at the University of Maryland. Kind of feel like a traveling band or something like that with a different gig in a different town. But we kind of see these 2 forums as kind of pieces of one greater whole. And so some of the candidates were able to make last night are not able to be here. We invited all the candidates, Democrats, Republicans, and the Libertarian nominee. 2 Republican candidates declined almost right away to appear. Former State Commerce Secretary Kelly Schultz and State Delegate Dan Cox. 2 candidates were, Democrats were with us last night and told us well in advance that they had conflicts and wouldn't be able to be here tonight. Former nonprofit CEO Wes Moore and former U.S. Labor Secretary Tom Perez. They were here with us last night. You can check out last night's forum on YouTube, on the Facebook pages of LCV and the Sierra Club and the NAACP, I believe. Another Democrat, former Prince George's County Executive Rushern Baker, initially told us he would be at both forums, and then on Monday, his campaign informed us that he'd be at neither. And State Comptroller Peter Francho's campaign notified us, well, initially said that he could not make it last night and that he would make it tonight. Less than 2 hours ago, his campaign notified us that he had a quote, unexpected personal matter and wouldn't be here tonight. I will point out that Comptroller Francho did put out a 30-second video on his social media pages on climate change today. I point that out. So we're going to start with opening statements, and embedded in that opening statement is going to be a climate question for each candidate. We will then go to questions from the panel. We're asking each candidate to go to a mic when they're speaking. During the question and answer period, we'll let the candidates know who's up next, so they can be ready too. For the opening statements, we will start at that end. So I think first I'd just like to introduce the candidates, and then we'll begin. And since I can't see anybody, I have to actually look at my cheat sheet about who's sitting where. So at the far right is a Democrat, former Maryland Attorney General Doug Gansler. Next to him is the Libertarian nominee, David Lashar, former state official, IT entrepreneur. Next to him, a Democrat, John Barron, a former Clinton administration official. Next to him, Laura Neuman, a Democrat, former Anne Arundel County executive. Next to her is former U.S. Education Secretary John King, a Democrat. Next to Secretary King is a Republican, Robin Ficker, a former state delegate and a real estate broker. Next to him is a Democrat, Jerome Segal, a retired college professor and researcher and founder of the Bread and Roses Party. And next to him is Ashwani Jain, a former Obama administration official. So welcome to the candidates, and let's begin with a 2.5-minute opening statement from Mr. Gansler. Embedded in this opening statement, we're asking each of the candidates a question, which is, what is your top climate priority for the state of Maryland? So General Gansler begin, and Mr. Lashar will be next.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you to the LCV and all the partners that are doing this tonight and last night, and thank you for all the candidates that did bother to show up, because they care about the environment. And so my relationship with the environment started when I was very little. All of you over 50 years old will remember this ad because it had an influence on all of us, which was a Native American who was canoeing down a river. It was pristine, and as the commercial evolves, there's trash all around. And at the end of the commercial, the Native American turns, and there's a tear going down his eye. By the way, he was actually an Italian guy, but needless to say, it had an influence on all of us. And I became an environmentalist at that point. And I'm the only environmentalist in this debate, and in fact, the only environmentalist running for governor. And I say, and it's very important for two reasons why we need to have an environmentalist. One is we need someone with credibility. You're going to hear a lot of rhetoric tonight. You're going to hear a lot of consultant notes. You're going to hear a lot of things about what we should do and what the problems are. But I'm the only person here that you're going to hear from tonight that actually has done things in the environment. And I'll talk about that during the course of the night. And second, we need a candidate that can win. And that's where Goucher College comes in, because the poll that was taken by Goucher and Ms. Cromer was to say that a moderate Republican, Kelly Schultz, will be the likely Republican nominee, beats a progressive Democrat in this state in the most Republican year in our lives by almost 20%. So we need to have somebody that can actually win. When I was state's attorney of Montgomery County, I started the first criminal environmental unit in the state's history. When I became, and I was there for 8 years, and when I became Attorney General, I appointed a special assistant for the environment. I then started an environmental council. Many people in the organizations here were part of that council. So the government and nonprofits would work together to figure out how to solve problems and crimes. In fact, since then, I've been in the private sector. After 23 years in government, 16 years in elected office, and I think one of our colleagues here was in office for 2 years. During that time, I'm actually representing states, including Vermont, in a lawsuit against fossil fuel companies over climate change. So we'll have an opportunity tonight to talk about some of the things that we did, and then we'll ask you to look at Green Maryland, where we have what we're going to do going forward, including having a climate czar appointed to make sure that we actually look at every issue through the lenses of the environmental challenges that are presenting to us. So thank you very much. Look forward to the opportunity to talk tonight.
Thank you. Mr. Lashar is next, and I did neglect to mention that there are timekeepers right in front of you, so please keep your eye out. Thank you.
Last night it was Josh, and he did a good job. So
happy to have shed that responsibility.
So good evening. I'm David Lashar, the Libertarian candidate for governor. And before I go into my standard introduction, I want to share that my grandmother went to Goucher back in the day when it was known as a finishing school. So it's nice to be here for my first time this evening. David Lashar, Libertarian candidate for governor. And for those in Maryland who are happy with what they've been seeing and getting from the Republican and Democratic parties over the last 10 years and more, you've got good options on the stage or not on the stage this evening to consider. But for those who have been less happy with what they've been seeing and getting, I'm standing as a principled, accomplished, and civil alternative. I'm an IT executive who has experience in federal and state government, and I live in Annapolis with my wife and my daughter. My wife has spent her entire career in environmental protection and natural resources. On the climate, I'm concerned, but I'm not panicked, because that's what my read of the science, including AR6 reports, says is appropriate. And I'll be talking about that tonight. We need to decarbonize using market-based approaches to promote clean energy. And for the clean energy portfolio, we need to diversify. We need to diversify beyond just wind and solar. We need to include alternative sources, including, but not limited to, nuclear power, sustaining what we already have, and promoting modern, modular nuclear, which has great potential for the state, the country, and the world. As a personal passion, I support the blueprint for the Bay, including action against Pennsylvania to make sure that the cost for fertilizer runoff into the Susquehanna is not borne by the Bay and Maryland and Virginia, but rather by the upstream producers in Pennsylvania. Right? A couple words on science, and then I'll wrap up. On science, science is it's a mindset and a method, not an answer. And the mindset is one of being humble and being skeptical. And the method is one of debate and dissent. I think that's all been too much missing in recent years. So David Lashar, Libertarian candidate for governor, concerned but not panicked, and supporting clean energy that is affordable and reliable for all Marylanders. Thank you.
Mr. Barron, and then Ms. Neuman.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Barron, former nonprofit executive. Before that, I was a Clinton administration official. I headed roughly $1 billion federal program. I've been an appointee of Democratic and Republican presidents, twice confirmed by the Senate. I've gotten major federal legislation enacted into law that's benefited Maryland and many other states. The reason I'm running for governor: Maryland isn't making progress on major problems that damage the lives of millions of people, and I'm offering a fundamentally different approach. In education, for instance, more than a quarter of middle school students in our state can't read at a basic level. More than a third can't do basic math. Those numbers are no different than they were 20 years ago. More than 500,000 Marylanders live below the poverty line, and our state has made zero progress reducing the poverty rate in more than 30 years. Low and moderate income Marylanders have seen stagnant wages since the 1980s as income inequality has soared. Fellow Marylanders, our state can't just keep doing the same thing we've been doing for decades, rolling out one unproven government program after the next and expect a different result. That hasn't brought progress, and it won't, for a simple reason. Many programs, no matter how well-intentioned they are, just don't work. If we're going to make progress, we have to expand programs that don't just sound like good ideas, but have been tested in the real world and shown to make a big difference in people's lives. That's been the mission of my career and of the bipartisan reforms that I've gotten enacted into law. Now it's time to bring this evidence-based approach that I've spearheaded to the state of Maryland. So when I'm the governor of Maryland, we're going to do what's proven to work. I'll give you one quick example. We're going to expand high-quality tutoring to every struggling first and second grader in the entire state of Maryland, because that has been shown to move them up toward grade level early, before their problems become serious in later grades. We're going to do it by engaging the community, including retirees and recent college graduates, to become tutors for a modest stipend as a public service. That's just one example, but the key theme is if we simply continue on our current course, we're going to be here in another 20 years, nothing will have changed. To make progress, we have to zero in on solutions that are tested and proven effective. Now, on climate policy, Maryland has actually made strong progress in this area. We've led the nation reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 38% since 2005. Tonight, I'm going to outline an ambitious regional initiative working with other states to build on that progress and lead the nation in climate change. Thank you.
Last night the chairs were too high. Tonight I think it's the microphone. Does that adjust? Or
This one is lower.
You think so? I need a box. Yeah. Oh, this is perfect. Thank you. Last night I was sitting on a bar stool and I had a dress and heels on. So tonight I came prepared, and the microphone's a little tall. My name's Laura Neuman. I'm really pleased to be here with you this evening. You know, when we talk about issues like climate change, we each come to this conversation with our own personal experience. I am born and raised in Maryland, born and raised in Baltimore City. And I will tell you, I've seen the very best and the very worst of what Maryland has to offer. I started out in inner city Baltimore at Jefferson and Montford Avenue. My parents were both high school dropouts and both had arrest records. And the environment wasn't something that we talked about growing up. In fact, you know, the streets were asphalt, the sidewalks were concrete, the houses were brick, and the roofs were tar. There was no such thing as the environment. In fact, we didn't know anything beyond the few streets that we lived on. You know, we talk about food deserts in the city, we should also talk about nature deserts. And it was from there that I went out into the world and in fact followed in my parents' footsteps, and I was also a high school dropout. My goal in life was really to have a path to opportunity. I was focused on whether I would eat or have shelter or have gas for my car. And so I didn't really have a chance to think about or know about, truthfully, that there was a world beyond the city streets of Baltimore until I was much older. You know, I lived out of my car for 6 months while I saved enough money for the down payment on an apartment. I was a waitress, and I really just wanted a path to opportunity. I eventually found it. I never finished high school and I never finished college, but I eventually got a master's degree in business without finishing high school or college, and I became a tech entrepreneur because I wanted a path to opportunity. I also wanted to go out and see the Chesapeake Bay once I found out that it was there, and at 27, I had my first experience on a sailboat. I moved to Annapolis 2 weeks later. I fell in love with the Bay, and to this day, it is a central part of my family's life. In fact, we grow oysters because we learned about the Oyster Restoration Project. If anybody wants free oysters, we have thousands of them. You can't sell them as a private citizen, and so we try to share them. It is an incredible project, and we're really thrilled to be part of it. And we're trying to do our small part, but the truth is we also love it. So I'm pleased to be here tonight and tell you that the Chesapeake Bay is my priority, and I'm honored to be on the stage with my esteemed colleagues. Thank you for being here. Good night. Not good night yet, just good night for now.
Let me first thank LCV and CCAN and the NAACP and Sierra Club and Goucher for bringing us all together on this important topic, and also for the work that the environmental community does every day fighting for climate action and environmental justice. My name is John King. I was a teacher and principal and United States Secretary of Education for President Obama. But I really come to this conversation driven largely by the fact that I'm a public school parent who worries about the future that my daughters will face in a world profoundly changed by climate change. I worry about all the evidence we see around us. The loss of farmland on the eastern shore to saltwater intrusion, the flooding we see regularly in many parts of the state, including Ellicott City, the asthma rates in Baltimore, which are some of the highest in the country. These are all illustrations that climate change and environmental injustice are a threat to our way of life. Now, you'll hear from the candidates tonight and from candidates in this race often platitudes and talking points, but not the specific commitments that reflect the climate emergency that we actually face as a state, country, and world. I come to this issue with experience as a national leader on the subject. I co-chair a national commission on K-12 climate action, bringing together civil rights leaders, environmental leaders, educational leaders, and youth activists to mobilize the education sector on climate. I founded a progressive advocacy organization in the state, Strong Future Maryland, that has worked together with many of the environmental organizations in the room to advance climate action in Maryland. And we have the specific plan for what we need to accomplish. The question was about our goal. To me, the goal that we should all share is to get to net zero by 2035. To accomplish that ambitious goal will require specific steps. It will require the state to lead by making sure the state fleet, all public buildings, all of our schools and campuses get to net zero. We need to have an electric state fleet. We have to have net zero public buildings. We have to make sure that that happens by 2030. We have to make sure that by 2030, 100% of our energy production is clean, renewable energy. We have to make sure that we are getting our transportation, 60% of our transportation by 2030 to electric. Those kinds of specific actions are what we should be focused on tonight so that Maryland can be the national leader we should be on this subject.
Hello, everybody. I'm Robin Ficker, running for governor. I've met many of you on the boardwalk in Ocean City the last 2 summers, where I spent basically the whole summer meeting voters. In 2 hours, you can meet someone from all 23 counties plus Baltimore City. You can tell how a person is going to act as governor by how they run their campaign. We had to choose a lieutenant governor candidate. I live in Montgomery County. I've lived there all my life. I have a law office in Prince George's County, or used to have one for 40-some years. And Leroy Yegi, where are you, Leroy? He just called me, was trying to find this place. He's my lieutenant governor candidate. He has lived in Dundalk for 56 years. You have to have representation in Annapolis, you have to have someone who can communicate and knows well the people of Baltimore County. That's why I chose Leroy Yegi, because I believe Baltimore County is very important. Half of life is showing up. When there's a forum for gubernatorial candidates in Baltimore County, I show up every single time because I want you to know that I'm going to be showing up down there for you in Annapolis. I remember the last 4th of July, I was the only candidate up here who was in the Dundalk, Towson, and Arbutus parades on the 4th of July, all 3 of them. And I'll be there again this fall. I have placed 25 questions on the ballot in my county, collecting 10,000 signatures for each. They have received 2,537,000 votes. That is a Maryland record. We passed term limits with 70% of the vote. We passed a limit on property taxes. We passed a question which eliminated the choice of putting a garbage dump in a residential zone. We passed a question which eliminated sewage sludge trenching in residential zones. I am the ultimate citizen activist, and I will be the ultimate governor representing the citizens like you. It's a very great pleasure to be here to talk to you tonight.
Dr. Segal?
So you don't know much about me, but I'm not just an academic. I know something about government. I have a PhD in philosophy. I've authored 7 books. But I also went back to school a second time, got a master's in public policy, worked on the Hill for 4 years, worked in the executive branch for 10 years, and then went to the School of Public Policy of University of Maryland for the last 20 years. Of the 7 books that I wrote, one of them is relevant to this campaign. It's called Graceful Simplicity, The Philosophy and Politics of Simple Living. Now, simple living was a big, hot topic around the turn of the end of the 20th century. If you went into a bookstore, however, they'd point you to the self-help section. My book was in the public policy section because the one thing I argued in the book is that all of these incredible ways of getting by with very little money made sense for very few people in the society. And the reality is the United States is an extraordinarily inefficient society where it costs a tremendous amount of money and translated into labor time, a tremendous amount of work in order to make in order to meet basic needs. And what we need is public policy that's user-friendly to people who want to live simpler lives. So that was the basic contribution of that. And out of that, I developed an agenda for what that public policy agenda would look like. And that agenda carried over when I ran for the first time against Cardin in 2018, and I ran on a Bread and Roses agenda. So that was that agenda, and it was not just a bread agenda, because the reason it was Bread and Roses is because the book was graceful simplicity. And the other contribution that the book made was I argued that our basic needs were not just the material ones, that we have a need for beauty and creativity in our lives. And so I articulated basically a notion of the good life that I called gracefulness. And the policy of Bread and Roses is not just bread and social justice with respect to it, it's also policy for a society of roses, in some ways a Renaissance society. So it's very utopian, but it's a society in which there's beauty, creativity, education for its own sake, there's meaning, there's self-respect, purpose-driven lives, passion work. That's what the Bread and Roses agenda is about. Oh my God, all right. I didn't get to the challenge that Maryland is facing. I'll use the next question to explain what I think the big challenge Maryland faces.
Thanks very much.
There's a lot of us candidates, we know. All right. Thank you all so much for putting this together and for having me. My name is Ashwani Jain, and I use he, him pronouns. and I'm running for governor to make our politics more inclusive and accessible. Now, this idea of inclusion started when I was 13 and diagnosed with cancer. During that time, I didn't think I would get to leave the four walls of that hospital room. And I found many who were making decisions for me as opposed to making them with me. I felt depressed, hopeless, and I felt helpless. But I also thought if I was blessed enough to get a second chance at life, I would make it count. And luckily, I not only beat cancer, but I was able to go from survivor to advocate. And that advocacy work has now led me to run for governor. And while I would be the nation's youngest governor and the nation's first millennial governor, where climate change is actually going to be really personal to me and my generation, I do have both the professional experience and perspective needed to serve the office of governor well. I have worked in public, private, and nonprofit sectors. I helped manage the political appointee process in the Obama White House. I worked on affordable health care issues at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I worked on affordable housing issues at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I helped get the NIH and the FDA billions in additional revenue when I was then Vice President Biden's Director of Outreach for the Cancer Moonshot. Equally important, I'm a product of Maryland public schools. I'm a son of immigrants and minority-owned small business owners. And I'm a cancer survivor who knows what it feels like to be written off or have others make decisions for me instead of with me. That's why we created the very first statewide campaign in the United States where 100% of our events are free, 100% of our policies, including our climate change policies, are written by residents and community activists, not consultants, and 100% of our campaign is run by volunteers from every age, background, and each of our counties, including Baltimore City. And so my climate priorities are to look at the issue of climate change in a comprehensive and sincere way, and include residents who are going to be impacted by those policies at the table from day one of my operation since I launched last January of 2021. So I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation tonight. You can always go to jainforgovernor.com to hold me accountable to learn more about the issues that I'm campaigning on. But with that, thank you so much.
Thank you. So we're now going to questions and answers, and I'm very privileged to be working with a great panel. It occurs to me that it's 3 women whose first names begin with S. So our first question will be from Sheilah Kast, and we're going to direct it to Secretary King, Ms. Neuman, and Attorney General Gansler in that order. So Sheilah, take it away.
And they have 1.5 minutes, right?
1 minute.
1 minute. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to address these issues. What are your specific plans for increasing access to affordable, renewable energy for Maryland residents?
Look, we have a tremendous opportunity, I think, to make energy more affordable by moving to renewable energy. We're seeing in this moment, given what's happening in the Ukraine, the stakes of tying our energy future to despots who control oil fields. Instead, we should be much more reliant on renewable energy. There's the opportunity in solar, in offshore wind here in Maryland, where we could be a national leader. There's the opportunity to move towards geothermal for heating and cooling. And so one of the things that we've proposed is essentially a review, an assessment, an audit that would be made available to Marylanders to figure out how they can reduce their home energy costs, as well as incentives for the development of renewable energy and for folks shifting over to solar panels in their home, to geothermal heating and cooling, to shifting over to electric cars. So we're committed to making sure that this greener future is also a more just and equitable future.
Thank you.
That's a great question. I'm really glad that you asked that. And I will be candid coming into this conversation. It's not a question I had given a tremendous amount of thought to, which really brings me to fundamentally why I'm running for governor, and that is that we need to have fairness for everyone in our community. And fairness starts with making sure that that applies to access to renewable energy. You know, I listened to an interview yesterday where they said, you know what, electric cars are not attainable for most people because they can't afford them. Wouldn't that be a great place to use some of this budget surplus that we have? How about if we make solar panels available to those in our community who really can't afford to put them on themselves? I 100% support that, and I tell you emphatically tonight that not only would that get a tax incentive, it would get additional funding in the budget. So I make that commitment here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. When I was Attorney General, we took on the big corporate polluters, and we got $4.6 billion, for example, against American Electric Power, biggest settlement in American history. We also took on PPG, which is a company in West Virginia that was sending mercury into the air into Western Maryland. I'll take on the utility companies if they don't provide access to opportunity for people that are underserved in underserved communities and communities of color. And we need to have renewable energy, so we have the competition. We need solar energy in our public spaces, our residential spaces, our commercial spaces. We need offshore wind off of Ocean City. We need to convert the 2 billion pounds of chicken manure that goes into the Chesapeake Bay each year into a power source, an eco-friendly power source with electric trucks bringing it in, and so make sure we have more open space and less sprawl. We've already, if you look at our Green Maryland platform, which is by far the most extensive environmental platform, because that's a huge issue for us, as it was when I was considered to be the Environmental Attorney General, when I was Attorney General, the head of the Attorney General Committee for the entire United States. We went after, on Reggie cases, we went after mercury. So we need to make sure we have renewable energy, chicken, poultry, solar, wind, and I'll turn it over to nobody.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Goucher's own Stella, and we'll be asking it of Mr. Jain, Mr. Barron, and Mr. Lashar.
As many of you know, agriculture is widely accepted to be the biggest contributor to Chesapeake Bay pollution. How do you plan to reduce farm runoff? Have you accepted, or do you plan to accept any campaign contributions from the poultry industry?
So thank you so much for that question. So I'll answer the second question first. No, and not only do we not accept donations from anyone from the poultry farm industry, we also don't charge any money to have a one-on-one with me. We don't host fundraisers on the campaign. 100% of our events are free and accessible to every single resident. We also don't take money from developers or corporations. In terms of the first question, we have to increase our poultry farm inspections, making sure we're limiting the use of poultry manure in the first place, making sure we're investing in stormwater detention systems, making sure we're including people in the agriculture industry, many of whom are small business owners, into the process, making sure that they have the resources they need to divert to cleaner energy sources, and making sure we're protecting our bay and looking at more renewable energy sources in a comprehensive manner, investing more in solar and wind and hydro, making sure we have environmental impact studies done for any piece of legislation that could impact our environment, making sure improving our composting facilities. Looking at all these in a comprehensive way is the approach in which I take. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barron, and Mr. Lashar next.
First of all, I am not taking any money from corporations, PACs, or Maryland lobbyists. Maryland deserves a governor who will answer to the voter and the voters, not to special interests. In terms of agricultural runoff, this is an area where the state, under the Hogan administration, has not provided enough resources to enforce existing laws. So that would be a key priority for me. I would also point out that overall on Chesapeake Bay Health, Maryland is doing pretty well. We are on track in most areas to meet the 2025 goals set out in the Chesapeake Bay Clean Water Blueprint. The problem is that other states are not. Pennsylvania and New York are very far from meeting the goals. So what's really needed for the governor to do and for our state to do is to work with the federal EPA to make sure that those other states are brought into compliance. That's number one. And second, to work partner to partner with other states and other state governors to make sure they control bay emissions.
Mr. Lashar.
Poultry industry. I would talk to them or anybody, meet with them, work with them or anybody else, but take the money. I already mentioned the impact of Pennsylvania, right, as far as fertilizer runoff goes. I agree with John. It's also coming from New York. I think that working with the Attorney General would be another tactic to use to get Pennsylvania and New York to adopt better agricultural policies. I think the one other tactic that I would offer is tax incentives for farmers to plant trees along their waterways. Riparian buffers, I believe, is the term of art, right? Incentives for that would be very affordable. I think that they would spur action, and I think they would have a good effect. So those would be my ideas.
Thank you. Next question comes from my neighbor, Staci Hartwell, and will be directed first at Mr. Ficker, then Ms. Neuman, then Dr. Segal.
Thank you. Candidates. Shortly after coming to office, Governor Hogan canceled the shovel-ready Red Line light rail project that would have brought 10,000 jobs in a 5-year construction phase, dramatically reduced commute times, and $3 to $6.5 billion in transit-oriented development. The Purple Line from Bethesda to New Carrollton was approved for construction and already has $12 billion committed to development along its corridor. The question, how would you make up for the economic development lost to Baltimore? And secondly, do you plan to revive the Red Line proposal in Baltimore?
Well, I can tell you this. The large companies in the United States are shunning Maryland. Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Google. They don't locate here. Intel, Texas Instruments, they don't locate here. I'm going to have an economic strike force, a job strike force with my Lieutenant Governor. Mr. Yegi, stand up, please, sir. And we may have a delegate or two. We may have some legal experts, zoning experts. We're going to go to these companies and bring jobs here so that we can afford a lot of the things we need, like the Red Line. Right now we have a budget surplus, but I think that by cutting the state sales tax 2 cents, giving everyone a fiscal stimulus, it'll create the impression that Maryland is business friendly. We'll bring in jobs, our revenue will go up, and we can build the things we need that right now are getting excuses for not being built.
Ms. Neuman, then Dr. Segal.
I grew up in public transportation in Baltimore City. My parents seldom had a car that worked. In fact, it didn't work as often as it did. And sometimes we didn't have a car at all. So in order to leave my immediate neighborhood, I had to get on the Mass Transit Administration. That wasn't a subway or the Red Line, it was a bus. And that bus connected to another bus. And that's how I got to the library if I wanted to go to one that wasn't in my neighborhood. I understand personally the importance of public transportation. And yes, I would fund it. And not only would I fund it, I would also look at opportunities to expand it. Until we provide safe, reliable, affordable public transportation for everyone in our community, we have not really served our community. And by the way, that's not just in Baltimore City, it's throughout Maryland. I've talked to other people in other parts of Maryland and they have the same concern. Baltimore City, unfortunately, has been neglected and is disenfranchised in this conversation. So I look forward to changing that. Thank you.
Dr. Segal.
So yes, unequivocally support the Red Line and the Purple Line and a lot more for mass transportation. But I come at it from a different perspective for different reasons. You heard what I said before about looking for policies that are user-friendly for people who want to live a simpler life. All right? The wisdom of simple living, and it's age-old, every wisdom tradition basically, is that there's a trade-off between time and stuff. And we live wrong, we don't live well when we sacrifice time for more stuff. We have to go in the other direction and have less stuff and more time. And of course, that's got its climate implications and so on. Well, what made that really possible for mankind was the revolution in agriculture. It used to be the case that people worked 70 or 80% of their time to have the food to stay alive. The revolution in agriculture made it possible, in fact, to satisfy your food needs as it does today. 15% of the household budget, which really corresponds to 15% of the time you work, is basically to have your, oh my God, all right, this is just terrible.
Terrible.
It's not
all right.
just me, it's these forums. You cannot develop a complex thought.
All right. So I've got the next question, and asking it of Attorney General Gansler, Mr. Barron, and then Secretary King. State agencies rarely have enough inspectors to check facilities such as poultry farms, rendering facilities, or trash recycling plants. So communities around these facilities often suffer from the ill health effects. How would you change the budgets of your agencies to ensure you're safeguarding public health? Mr. Gansler, start with you.
The budget is a moral document. And when you start by having an environmentalist as governor, you're going to make sure that we have enough inspectors. That we had issues with that when I was Attorney General in terms of the CAFOs and some of the other areas that were woefully under-inspected. And so we would need to make sure that our climate czar is working with people that have a climate focus within each agency in Maryland state government. I was fortunate enough to serve for 16 years running agencies, and we were able to actually manage our job and have a long record of accomplishment, particularly in the environmental field. It just has to be a priority, and you just have to make sure that you do it, and then you have to enforce it. And so when we go after these companies that pollute, we did 22 river audits when I was Attorney General all throughout the state, and we went to each of the rivers and identified what works and what didn't work and who was polluting and who needed to be prosecuted. Well, we need to make sure we have that same attitude when we're running the executive branch going forward.
Mr. Barron, then Secretary King.
So Maryland has done very well in reducing climate change. We've led the nation, as I mentioned, in reducing carbon emissions over the past 15 years. One of the main reasons is because we are part of a regional initiative called RGGI with 10 other states, where we put a cap on the amount of power plant emissions, an enforceable cap, and let industry decide through emissions trading, it's called cap and trade, how to achieve how to meet those caps in the most cost-efficient manner. It's been very successful. Among all the RGGI states, it's reduced carbon emissions by 47% over the past 10 years since RGGI began. I want to bring that same approach to other sectors of the economy, not just power plants where RGGI applies, but transportation and buildings and industry. What that would do when we auction off permits to emit, it would create a new source of revenue. RGGI, I think, generates about $60 million a year. That is a new source of revenue that I would use to rebate to disadvantaged communities and also to provide the resources for environmental inspections. Thank you.
You know, the stakes of environmental injustice are very high, and they affect people's day-to-day lives. You know, I think about when I was a teacher and had students who missed school because of asthma that was due to the air pollution in their community. And so we have to hold folks accountable. That means we have to staff state agencies appropriately. Governor Hogan's left now 4,000 openings in state government. It's not just a problem in the Department of the Environment, it's a department across state agencies not having the capacity to do their job, like enforcing regulations against poultry companies. But we need to do more. We ought to adopt a constitutional amendment that gives folks environmental human rights, that gives folks the ability to take folks to court, to take the corporate polluters to court and hold them responsible for the damage they're doing. And we have to make sure that every state agency and the General Assembly considers climate when adopting any new policy, regulation, or statute. Just like there's a fiscal impact statement, there should be a climate impact statement. This is a crisis and we need to act like it.
Sheilah has the next question, and First for Mr. Jain, then Mr. Barron, and then Attorney General Gansler.
What efforts will your administration support to decarbonize Maryland's government operations and/or Maryland's economy? Will you commit to investing in green or environmentally friendly schools, libraries, and other public facilities to reduce Maryland's carbon footprint?
Yeah, thank you again for that question. The short answer is all the above. In our climate change policy memo that we've shared since January of 2021 at jainforgovernor.com, we talk about making sure we have smart growth and mixed use development. One part of my Maryland Now plan is to make public transit free for every resident of the state of Maryland. It is also fully paid for. Making sure that we're stopped subsidizing trash incinerators and paper mills. Making sure we're improving composting. A lot of our facilities can't even process food scraps. That doesn't make any sense. Making sure we have more designated bus lanes and HOV lanes. Making sure that we are banning single-use plastic bags and increasing the fossil fuel fee. And making sure we're investing in solar power. Starting with the state capitol building, making sure on all government buildings and all public schools, we have solar panels there. And we're redeveloping brownfields, which are essentially old landfills that are too polluted to generate housing or education or any other sort of revenue. They would be great for solar fields. And for the times when it's a little too expensive for residents to put solar fields on their buildings or on their homes, using community solar and having tax incentives to provide those.
Mr. Barron, then Attorney General Gansler.
So my top priority, as I mentioned in climate, is to bring the successful approach that's worked regionally for power plants to other sectors of the economy, like transportation, which accounts for 36% of carbon emissions in Maryland. That's the approach that the state of California and Washington have taken. It is a bipartisan approach. The regional approach, it was originated by the Republican governor of New York, George Pataki, many years ago. It has industry buy-in. It's what works. It is successful. It's working. We should bring it to other sectors of the economy and could achieve those major reductions in power plants in areas like transportation and buildings. I also support, when it comes to government buildings and government vehicles, a similar approach, setting performance standards, enforceable performance standards, like a 30% reduction in emissions and so on, but leave it up to industry to determine how to achieve that in the most cost-effective manner and which technology to use. Thank you.
I intend to make Maryland the East Coast leader on the environment, sort of like the California of the West. And by doing so, we need to do things like mass transit. We need to have the southern branch from Branch Avenue down to Waldorf. We need to have mass transit. We need to have the red line. We need to have the purple line. We need to have the link from up 270 from Frederick to Shady Grove. We need to use the Woodrow Wilson Bridge to connect the subway, which was built for. So that's part of it. We also need to lead by example in government. We need to make sure every state building is LEED certified. We need to make sure we have electric vehicles. We need to make sure that our state has the infrastructure for the onslaught of electric vehicles. And this is something that, you know, the federal government is working on. The private sector is actually figuratively and literally leading the change to electric vehicles. But if you walk outside these doors, you're not going to see the infrastructure that supports that. So there's a lot of different areas that we need to work on. We need to continue to work. The reason why Maryland's doing so well is because of some of the enforcement that's been going on. We need to make sure the next Attorney General works with the governor to enforce those laws.
Thank you. The next question will come from Stella, and we'll start with Dr. Segal, then Secretary King, then Mr. Lashar.
How important is it for you to make Maryland a leader on fighting climate change and to be seen as a climate leader yourself? And to be seen as a climate leader yourself?
The last thing about being seen as a climate leader is very important. I didn't answer before what the real challenge facing Maryland is. The real challenge is actually making a difference with respect to climate outcomes. Maryland is spinning its wheels in a conversation about whether or not we should set 2060 or 2050 or 2040 as the climate goal. You know what? It may reveal something about people. It may make you feel good. It doesn't make any difference in terms of climate outcomes. Look, if it's 2020 or it's 2060, how does that affect the level of the Chesapeake? Will it rise 3 inches more on one and less on the other? No. 1 inch? No. You won't be able to measure it. It's the same thing with respect to global warming. It makes no difference. So the issue for Maryland is actually, what can we do that would make a difference? And there are a lot of things that would make a difference. There are technological breakthroughs that we could work on. There are social inventions. For instance, I have a proposal for a near free EV that if that caught on and we were seen as a leader would affect the whole country. And EVs would start with poor people.
Thank you. Secretary King.
Maryland should be a leader on climate action for moral reasons and economic reasons. The moral reasons are failing to act on climate is dooming future generations to the consequences, whether that's the loss of waterfront homes, whether that's the climate refugees that we will see. My mother was from Puerto Rico. When you think about what's happened there because of Hurricane Maria and the long-term consequences, that's what the whole world is facing if we don't take action. So that's the moral charge. But there's also an economic benefit for Maryland in leading on climate. We can see that here in Baltimore County, where a steel plant that was closed is now reopening to produce steel for wind turbines. That's economic opportunity that can come through offshore wind. There's economic opportunity in leading the country on battery storage and developing battery storage technology in the state. There's opportunity in being the national leader on solar. So this is good for our economic development as well as the morally right thing to do.
Mr. Lashar, yes, sorry.
Definitely want to be a leader. To be honest, though, I would want my main legacy to have been a leader in helping to work with all stakeholders to turn around the city of Baltimore. That would be what I would want as my main legacy. But on the climate, for specific actions that I would want to take to keep us as a leader, to make us more of a leader than we already are across the nation. Some steps that I would want to take for clean energy. I think we should run demonstration projects of alternatives, emerging technologies, encourage that. I think that we can be leaders in sustainable agricultural practices. And I think that we could step forward and leverage the Bay, take advantage of our natural heritage with the Bay, and as we make it cleaner, also make it #1 destination for ecotourism in the U.S., or at least a leading and known destination for ecotourism. So there's a few ideas for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Staci will have the next question. We'll start with Ms. Neuman, then Mr. Ficker, and then Mr. Jain.
During the pandemic, transit ridership has fallen across the country. Because Baltimore's workforce has a high percentage of essential workers, Baltimore's ridership fell about 55 to 60% compared to 94% in the California Bay Area. With 2 out of 3 jobs in our region requiring at least 90 minutes commute by public transportation, how would you determine the level of investments you would make in public transit services?
You know, there are certain things that are fundamentally essential to leadership in government. If we're going to serve our community and serve it well, we need to make sure that we're serving everyone. And transportation is absolutely central in that question. Education, transportation, public safety. If we don't do that well, we haven't done anything well. You would find me, without a doubt, the leader in public transportation because I've lived it personally. I know what it feels like to wait for a bus. I know how it feels to take 3 buses to get where you want to go. And if we want to do the best work that we can for the community that we serve, then we will make sure that it is available to everyone and that it is affordable and that it is safe. You know, it's hard to understand how difficult that challenge is if you haven't lived it personally. And I would challenge every person on this stage to try and get from one side of Baltimore to the other on public transportation. Tell me how many different modes of transportation you take and how long it takes you to get there. Thank you.
Mr. Ficker, then Mr. Jain.
Thank you, Staci. My favorite four-letter word is J-O-B-S. We need to bring jobs into Maryland. President Biden mentioned the $20 billion semiconductor plant that's locating in Ohio. Remember in his State of the Union? That plant should have been in Maryland. There have been 20, $30 billion semiconductor plants in Arizona, North Carolina, Texas. We should have one in Maryland. We should have one near Baltimore so that these folks who were worried about how they're going to get across town or how they're going to pay their rent, they'll be earning $40 an hour making semiconductors, and believe me, they'll be able to find a way to get here from here to there. We need to bring in some jobs, and Maryland has fallen short. Our job strike force is going to bring in these powerful companies that have good paying jobs. Then some of the other problems fall to the wayside.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. As I mentioned in my last remarks, part of my Maryland Now plan is to make Maryland the very first state that guarantees free public transit for every resident. Not only is this going to help individuals get to and from work, not only is it going to help businesses get more customers and get more loyal employees, it's going to help seniors and retired folks who are not able to right now get around their town or their cities. It's going to help those with disabilities who are also not able to leave their homes in a productive manner. And it's also just going to make sure that we're reducing the negative impacts done to our climate from the fossil fuel industry. So free public transit is one of my biggest plans, and you can find it at jainforgovernor.com. It is also fully paid for. But then we have to go beyond that. Finishing the purple line. Yes, investing in the red line, making sure we have a Southern Maryland rapid transit project, making sure we're expanding MARC train services, including to Western Maryland, and including residents, those folks that you mentioned, in the decision-making process, which is what my campaign has done since day one.
Thank you. We'll do an environmental justice question now. We'll ask it of Mr. Barron, then Mr. Lashar, then Mr. Jain. So how will you prioritize and ensure that funding that's allocated to address environmental injustice will be used in the communities most impacted by climate change? And who in your administration will oversee this effort? Mr. Barron.
The initiative that I've outlined, where we auction off permits to pollute and have enforceable caps, will generate a substantial amount of revenue. What we do with that revenue, we should rebate it to communities that are disadvantaged, also rural communities that might be adversely affected by slightly higher gas prices, and we should also use that revenue to invest in environmental justice initiatives, making sure that trash incinerators like the Baltimore trash incinerator and other polluting sources that are near disadvantaged communities are retrofitted, are closed down. We transition away from that. So the vision that I've outlined will generate the resources needed to invest in environmental justice initiatives like those.
Mr. Lashar, then Mr. Jain.
Yep. First of all, the easy part is making sure as governor that we met the mandates that were passed and the metrics and the goals that were passed through the General Assembly and put into law. Follow through. It's not just passing laws, it's following through and making sure they come to be. So that would be a priority. Second, I think it is important, the question of who would be responsible for answering to climate justice and making sure that we're accounting for the impact, the disparate impact of past policies and past events on different communities and populations. And in my administration, it wouldn't be the climate czar. I would have those responsibilities in my number two, my Lieutenant Governor, Christiana Logan Smith. And so she would be with me, she would be an empowered voice, and her portfolio, her main three objectives, responsibilities, would be energy, environment, and economy. including justice. Thank you.
So for me, climate justice is about including residents, especially those impacted by all the decisions, all the policies we're talking about, at the table in a very easy manner. And to prove that, that's why we're running our campaign to be entirely 100% crowdsourced by these residents, by these community members, by these activists, and also making sure that you're creating an administration where you have those leading these different agencies and these different initiatives who have those lived experiences. One of my jobs in the Obama administration was help managing and diversifying the political appointee process, whether it was at the Department of Education, Department of Labor, Department of Energy, the EPA, making sure that those residents, those community members had a real leadership role within the administration. And it's those lessons and that experience that I would take if elected governor in my administration, making sure that anyone who's running my agencies is accountable, accessible, but also understands personally the impact of the policies they will be in charge of enforcing.
Thank you. We're going to try to squeeze 2 more questions in. Stella will ask the next of Attorney General Gansler, then Dr. Segal, then Mr. Ficker.
Plastics are a major source of pollution that affect fish and crabs. Individual cities have put... Sorry, I can't hear. What's the first word? Would you like me to repeat?
Yeah. Please.
Plastics are a major source of pollution that affect fish and crabs. Individual cities have put into effect plastic bag bills, but most jurisdictions do not have them, and neither does the state. As governor, what would you do to reduce plastics and microplastics in our waterways? What measures will you take to require manufacturers and merchants to cover the true cost of the production and use of plastics?
For Josh Kurtz's sake, I'll talk about plastics and Dustin Hoffman, but it's actually a real issue, and it's every county in Maryland, the whole state should ban them. It's horrible. When I was Attorney General, we did the 22 river audits. We had to use cypre funds that we got from all the enforcement, where we broke every record in the country, and when I was the head of all the Attorneys General for the environmental group, we took those funds and put in measures to reduce and pick up the trash. And we practiced what we preached. Every year we had to clean up the Bay Day, Attorney General's office. We had 800 employees, and we had people come down and actually pick up the plastic bags and the trash. So we need to make sure that we use the technologies there are other sources besides plastic, and we need to make sure we keep the waterways clean. I went after Omega, which is a company that was taking all the menhaden out of the water that was for fish oil, that was creating a problem for rockfish and the environment there. We need to have living shorelines, and there's a lot we can do in terms of cleaning up the waterways in Maryland.
Well, I may be the only veteran up here. I may be the only real estate broker up here. I may be the only farmer up here who owns a tractor, but I know that I'm not the only one that's upset about all these plastic bottles that you see in the bay. You see them all over the place. In Montgomery County, we have an excellent recycling plant. We have an excellent recycling system where people every week put out their bottles, their plastic. We've got to recycle. Now, I know that the biggest contributors to the dead zones in the ocean are Vietnam, China, the Philippines, that part of the world. But we need to educate our youth, and that should be part of the educational system in every school to teach people recycle the plastic. And we need to put pressure on the manufacturers so that their plastic disintegrates within a short time rather than a lifetime.
Dr. Segal, you're next.
Let me relate to the corporate behavior aspect of the question. We get more plastic and the wrong kind of plastic because that's the way corporations maximize their profits. The Business Roundtable came out with a remarkable statement recently about how maximization of profits no longer is an acceptable bottom line for corporations. The question is, how do we translate that from a statement into reality? There's one great thing about being a socialist. I'm not trying to overthrow capitalism. I'm not trying to nationalize anything. I'm interested in shrinking capitalism in our lives, meaning basically job system work, free time, and then going to passion work. But as a socialist, we keep a big stick in the back of our pocket. And so if need be, we will exercise a right of eminent domain and take over any corporation that isn't actually doing what it should by way of the environment. We won't keep it under government, but we'll dump out that board, we'll populate it with all stakeholders and nonprofits, and we'll put it back in the market. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question. Sheilah will ask the last question. We'll start with Secretary King, then Mr. Lashar, then Ms. Neuman. Sheilah.
Last question. How will you ensure that young people will have the opportunity to have high impact and high quality jobs centered in mitigating and preventing climate change?
We've got to see preparing young people for jobs in the green economy as an opportunity for the state. Last year, the General Assembly passed the Blueprint for Maryland's Future over the governor's veto. That includes new funding streams for career and technical education. We should have programs starting in our high schools to prepare young people for green jobs in partnership with community colleges and employers. We should be investing more in our community colleges and our HBCUs as institutions that can help build that future green economy workforce. My grandmother went to University of Maryland Eastern Shore, graduated in 1894. That's an institution that has been an engine of opportunity for generations. We ought to have a center of excellence in regenerative agriculture there, preparing folks for that future part of our green economy. But we need a governor who's committed that education is at the foundation of the long-term health of our economy and our democracy. As a teacher running for governor, that's exactly what I would do.
It's an interesting question. Because the answer is going to be beneficial not just to those who want to have careers in the green economy. The answer is one that benefits everybody no matter what they want to do. And so it's really an education question is what I see your question as. And what we need is better schools in which students have choice as to where they go, and schools have choice as to what they teach. Right? We need to take the model that works so well in higher education, right? Different schools with different specialties, and then students and their families get to decide which ones they want to go to. Under a choice-based model, we can have schools that have relatively more green-oriented curricula. And the students who are interested in that can choose to go there. So I'm going to always respect the choices of parents and students, and I want to I want to allow educators to have the curricula that they want. Thank you.
Fundamentally, I don't think that we'll be preparing the next generation for jobs in the environment or climate. The truth is, we're not pulling them along, they're pushing us. I have 2 teenage children, and I can tell you they probably know more about the environment than anyone sitting in this room. We've made sure that they're educated, they're informed, and they care. And they also have, in addition to being the environmental generation, they also are the innovation generation. They will come up with new ideas. They will come up with new solutions. I believe in them, and the truth is that I already have interesting, informed conversations with my kids around the dinner table. If you talk to any employer in the state of Maryland, they'll tell you the importance is matching up job skills with job opportunities. It is rare to talk to a young person today who can't talk about sustainability in the environment. I'm encouraged for the future, while at the same time cautious about the mistakes we've made.
Well, thank you. This was, very informative and thought-provoking. We've reached the point of closing statements already. We will start with Secretary King, move down my way, then jump over to Mr. Gansler, and then end with Ms. Neuman. There's been some confusion about whether we're going to do 2 minutes or minute-and-a-half statements. So let me put it this way. We'll give you 2 minutes, but extra credit if you do it in a minute and a half. So Secretary King.
Look, the stakes of this conversation are incredibly high. You know, Michelle Seary, my running mate from Baltimore County, is here. When we talk about this issue, we talk about this as an existential crisis. And we need to act like we are facing an existential crisis. That means we need specific, ambitious plans. It means that we need to commit to get to net zero by 2035. The risk is that we've missed the moment. I think about a school board member from Santa Barbara, California, who testified before the K-12 Climate Action Commission that I chair. And she described how when she ran for school board, she ran on a climate platform. And then as a school board member, she would raise her hand and say, why aren't we getting electric buses? Why aren't we putting solar panels on school buildings? Nobody would listen. And then there were droughts, and then there were fires, and then there were mudslides, and there was loss of life. And then finally, the community mobilized around climate action. We don't want to make the mistake of waiting. We need to act boldly on these issues. And when people look at our plan at johnkingforgovernor.com, they may say, well, this is a long shot. This seems very ambitious. Well, I say to them, yeah, my whole life is a long shot. My mom passed away when I was 8. My dad when I was 12. When it was just my dad and me, my dad was struggling with Alzheimer's. When I was in high school, after my dad passed, I moved around different family members, different schools, actually got kicked out of high school. I always tell folks I'm the first United States Secretary of Education. I've been kicked out of high school. But I was blessed that there were teachers and public schools that saved my life, that gave me a second chance. So I believe in long shots. And we as a society have to step up in this moment of climate crisis and build not only a green economy, but a more just economy going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Ficker.
Well, I'm not going to curse the darkness. I'm going to light a candle. And one thing I'm going to do about climate change is we have Calvert Cliffs nuclear plant. It provides energy for 1 million homes in Maryland. I want to double that plant and bring in nuclear energy provided electricity for another 1 million homes. That's what I'm going to do for climate change. I'm going to bring in good people in my administration. I like Mr. King very much. I'd like him to serve in my administration after the election. We need to keep an eye on the big companies in America. Facebook just signed the largest lease in Austin, Texas history. Why didn't they locate in Baltimore? Microsoft has 100 times the space in Northern Virginia that it does in Maryland. Google has 30 national headquarters, not one in Maryland, despite the fact that one of its founders, Sergey Brin, graduated from the University of Maryland. We need to bring these companies into Maryland. Intel, $30 billion semiconductor plant. Why didn't it locate here? Texas Instruments. I know their name's Texas, but why did they have to locate in Texas and not in Maryland, not near Baltimore, where some of the people who were playing with guns and fentanyl could get a really great job and turn their life around? Jobs. I'm going to bring in some jobs in Maryland. Nice to be with you.
Thank you, Dr. Segal, and then Mr. Jain.
So I said earlier that the biggest challenge facing Maryland is to figure out how to make a difference in terms of outcomes. And that means actually affecting something much bigger than Maryland. In the biggest terms, it means affecting the world. What I think Maryland can do beyond the things that I talked about before about making a difference is it can model the difference between growth and development. It can model a choice of time rather than stuff. And I call that, I wrote a book about it, and I would call it for Maryland to become the graceful simplicity state. And on my website, I have 9 categories of utopian transformations that would be involved in that. Re-imaging work, right? Leveling, right? Education for its own sake. Beauty for all, a Marshall Plan for Baltimore, global humanization, friending the earth, and it goes on. And under each one of these, I've got a half a dozen or a dozen specific policies. So an enormous amount of work has gone into developing the policy basis for how, in fact, can we model and how can we become the graceful simplicity state. Now, it may sound utopian to you, and it is, but here's the point. Dealing with climate change has expanded enormously the time frame in which we do policy. We're now thinking in 28-year blocks between now and 2050. 28 years, right? 28 years is enough time to do utopia, much more. I'm Jewish. My point of reference is the rise and fall of the Third Reich. 1933 to 1945, 12 years. 12 years, and Germany went from the Weimar Republic to Nazi fascism and back again. In 28 years, we can remake the world. The point is to think big. What we want to come out of this with is not having beat back climate change, it's having transformed Maryland and through it the world.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much for this opportunity. Once again, my name is Ashwani Jain, and I am running for governor to make our politics inclusive and accessible. Because when you talk about any issue, climate change, reproductive justice, housing, healthcare, education, criminal justice, economic development, if residents are not given a seat at the table from day one, none of these policies are going to be equitable. We have seen this time and time again in every election. That's why, unlike other candidates, I am fully accessible, because 100% of our events are free. I don't charge residents to have a one-on-one with me. And through my mobile campaign offices, both my running mate and I are personally and consistently in a different county each and every day of the week. Unlike other candidates, I am fully accountable, because 100% of our campaign is run by residents from every single county, age, and background. You already have a seat at the table from day one of my operation. Unlike other candidates, I am fully transparent, because we've shared the most detailed and comprehensive and fully paid for policy agenda since last January 2021. And unlike other candidates, we have proven that we can build a winning campaign with the most volunteers without needing to constantly fundraise. You can always go to jainforgovernor.com to learn more. If you want to have a one-on-one conversation with me to talk about any issues we discussed tonight or issues that were not discussed, I'm happy to make the time to do so. Thank you so much.
General Gansler.
Thank you all for coming here tonight. And during my 23 years in government, I've been focused on making sure Maryland is a safer, stronger, and more just state. I grew up in the state. I love this state. I wear the flag everywhere on my body, and I'll leave it at that. But we need to make sure that our next governor has that kind of experience, not just because I'm old and been around a long time, because I understand how the levers of government work. When I got standing for some of the partners here tonight, the LCV and others, to sue polluters around and be part of the permitting process and sue polluters, that was important. Today I announced I actually filed for governor with Candace Hollingsworth, my lieutenant governor, which is wonderful. She was the mayor of Hyattsville for 6 years, transformed that city, then left to start our Black Party, which is a national organization. And we are the team for this moment. I'm going to ask for your support as we go forward, because we need to win. We need to actually win this election. Professor Cromer took the poll. It said that in the most Republican year we're going to ever see in our lifetime, no matter how old you live, which is this year, 2022, Kelly Schultz wins by 20% over somebody that has no experience and never been vetted and thinks that being governor is a starter job in Maryland politics. And so the RGA, the Republican Governors Association, apparently took a poll and saw that I'm the only Democrat that could actually win this year. And the reason why that's important is not to be braggy, because I'm not. It's because everything we've talked about tonight, all the mass transit projects, all the climate reduction, getting the carbon reduction for the climate and climate change that we're facing right now, none of that's going to happen. I mean, you saw it. Governor Hogan took a sledgehammer to Baltimore when he canceled the red line. And that's what you're going to see for another 4 years of Republican leadership. So we actually need to have a candidate that can win the general election, who has progressive values, has the environment as one of their top priorities. And thank you again for being here tonight.
Last night, for my closing remarks, I actually didn't know what I wanted to say. Tonight I do. And what I want to do is say a few words to Maryland's youth. Because as any candidate will tell you, the best part of campaigning is being out on the trail. It's out meeting people, talking to them, hearing about their troubles, and generating ideas about how maybe you can help. That's what's good about being a candidate. And as I've been doing that, I've had a surprise, and it's when I talked to youths in Maryland, I found out how very distressed they are about climate change. I've talked to youths who literally are saying that their worries are keeping them up at night. And I want to give you hope, a few words of hope. First of all, I want you to remember some of the words of hope, some of the trends that John Barron shared with you today. There's a glimmer. And then I want to point to the science itself. I mentioned this at the outset. The science that the New York Times, the Washington Post report, it's all based in the AR, the assessment reports from the IPCC, sponsored by the UN. This is the science that everybody is talking about. But the headlines that we read from New York Times and Washington Post, they're not reporting on everything that's in the report. There are 5 scenarios in the assessment report. And where the headlines are coming from is the worst case scenario. I'd encourage you to dig in, because when you look at, I'm not going to try to sell you the best case scenario. Look at the mid case scenario. There's hope. It tells me it's not 4 degrees of rise in temperature by 2100 or more than that. It's looking like, according to the assessment report, more like 2.5, okay? Now that's not to be ignored, but what I submit to you is that what we have is not an emergency, a challenge, and I would be delighted for you to consider me to lead all of us in rising to meet that challenge. But most of all, don't lose sleep. Thank you.
So I am the only candidate here tonight who has outlined an actual vision, an ambitious vision, for how to reduce greenhouse gases in Maryland. It recognizes first and foremost that Maryland is one mid-sized state, and this is a big planet. So we are most effective when we act regionally, when under RGGI, the regional initiative I described, for example, we are partnering with New York and New Jersey and other big states. That's number one. Number two, the regional initiative has been extraordinarily successful in reducing power plant emissions by nearly 50%. I want to bring that same approach to other sectors of the economy. I would immediately join the new Transportation and Climate Initiative program, TCIP, joining Massachusetts and Rhode Island and the District of Columbia in bringing that same approach to transportation, and I would bring it to other areas as well. Beyond that, I would lead as my own I would be the environmental czar of my own administration, because I would lead in trying to get other governors to join this regional initiative. This is a big, systematic, ambitious effort. That's what separates me from the other candidates who are talking about a bunch of individual initiatives. This is a vision. Let me return to the education and the other social problems that I described earlier. In those areas, I want to bring a new governing approach to our state, one where we are not just rolling out the next new plan and hoping that it's going to work. That's what we've been doing for 30, 40 years. I mean, 20 years from now, let's say, will our children look back at this time and say that we faced all of these persistent problems, stagnant wages, stagnant education, stagnant poverty, and we just kept doing the same thing again and again? Or will they say that Maryland pioneered a new approach based on evidence about what actually works in education and job training, and that we finally moved the needle on education, stagnant wages, health care, and other problems? Thank you.
All of us here tonight talking about the environment do so from a point of privilege. We can talk about the environment because there's room in our lives to talk about it. As we stand here at Goucher College, I want you to know that this is a place I dreamed of going to school to. I dreamed of going to school here. And let me be even more specific about it and tell you, I came to the library just so that I could be on the grounds of this school when I was 20. Going to college wasn't an option for me, but it was my dream for a very long time. When I decided to run, it is because I went back to the childhood home that I grew up in East Baltimore. I was asked to go back to be interviewed for a documentary. I've lived an incredibly fortunate life. It's had its challenges for sure, but overall I feel incredibly grateful and fortunate. I met the boy who lives in the house that I grew up in. While I was being interviewed, he was curious. The house is maybe 12 feet wide and has marble steps out front, and he came out to watch. He sat on the steps to see what we were doing, and I'm a mom, so of course I started talking to him. And I watched this 11-year-old boy watch every car that went down Jefferson Street, and I realized he knows who's in each car, and he knows which ones are safe and which ones are not. And I thought about that child afterwards, and I was like, gosh, what is his outcome? What is his education outcome? What is his public safety outcome? What is his healthcare outcome? That child doesn't know the environment. That is not part of his conversation. He will probably never see the majestic Chesapeake Bay, the waves of Ocean City, or the mountains of Western Maryland and Garrett County. If we want to talk about the environment, let's talk about opportunity for everyone in our state. And if we want everyone to care about it, let's make sure everyone gets to experience it. Thank you for having us tonight. It was an honor to be here.
It takes a lot to put yourself out there and run for office. Let's please give these candidates a big hand. Thank you to the audience, both here live and out there in internet land. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you to our great hosts at Goucher, Malia Cromer. Thanks, everybody, and don't forget to vote. Thank you.